Hey guys, welcome back. So today I brought home this 5,000 watt Powermate generator. It is powered by a Briggs and Stratton engine, and the title on this listing was Free Generator. And when stuff like this goes up for free, it goes in minutes. Thankfully, Jason from Pate's Performance noticed it right away, and he messaged Ken of Ken's Small Engine, who was local to the person that was giving this away. Ken picked it up, messaged me, and here it is. So thank you guys for that. I do appreciate it. Anyway, in the description, the person who gave this away stated that the engine is spinning over freely, the piston is not moving, and he was able to push the piston down. So the piston's not seized, but it was more than he wanted to deal with, so he just wanted to get rid of it. Anyway, before tearing this thing down for parts, I do want to validate the diagnosis, and the engine actually isn't turning over at all now. I think most likely the piston got pushed too far down and is now making contact with the crank. So I need to get the carb off, the blower housing off, and see if I can back the engine up to see if that piston is moving. And I mean, worst case, this is parts. Potentially it could be rebuilt, but I won't know till I get it off and opened up. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this thing. Okay, so at least the crankshaft spins. It almost makes it 360 degrees around, but it does get hung up right at about top dead center. So that kind of makes sense. That is where the crankshaft journal is closest to most likely where the piston is or what's left of the connecting rod. So I'm going to pop the spark plug out, see if I can see anything, but I am pretty sure that the connecting rod is blown on this. Well, it is pretty much impossible to get a screwdriver in there or even look in there with the amount of clearance I have here. So I'm going to use this magnetic retrieval tool just to put down to where the piston is, and we'll rotate the engine, see if this moves at all. Yeah, and we get nothing. So Connecting rod's definitely blown. This engine has to come apart. So before I can get this engine opened up, I do need to get the stator and the rotor off. And even before that, I'm going to pull the gas tank and drain the oil. Believe it or not, this engine is full of what looks to be clean oil. So it took quite a long time to get that oil out. It was about 30 minutes in total. And initially I was thinking maybe the wrong oil was in there and that's what killed this engine. But when pouring that oil tray into another container for recycling, it actually flowed quite well. So I think the oil actually was fine. Most likely there's just some debris from the engine, like engine parts, blocking this passage. All right, now we got to get the stator off. This one has the outlets built in to the end cap here. And this should come off as one piece. I guess first I do want to get the brushes off so we don't damage them. And then there's two bolts holding the stator down, so I'll get those loose. We can lift it up, slide a piece of wood to support the engine, and then remove these four bolts going around, and the stator and outlets should slide off as one unit. All right, so now we got to get the rotor off. And my usual bag of tricks aren't going to work with this Powermate setup. There's a few reasons for that, but usually what I do is I put threads here and cut a rod to slide down the shaft, which will push on the crankshaft when the bolt is tightened down. But in this case, the diameter here is the same as the bolt. And for this to work, you really need to put a rod that's a little bit larger in diameter so it doesn't go down and push into the thread. So this really isn't going to work. The other method also involves tapping threads and using a bolt with Teflon on it. And you fill the shaft with water, crank down, and the hydraulic pressure pops the rotor off. But not in this case. This bushing has a seam going around it, so any attempt to build up pressure, it's just going to leak out. So there still are a couple options. I think first is just hitting it with a dead blow hammer, so I'm going to give that a try. The frame's kind of in the way, so it may not work too well. And lastly, I could take an extra bolt I have, cut it down, and put a notch for a screwdriver. And literally you could just screw this in until it's about maybe 1/3 of an inch down, and then do the bolt trick and just push it off. So that would definitely work, but it'll take less time if hitting it with a hammer works. So we'll try that first. Yeah, I think I'll just cut an extra bolt down. It is possible to get it off with a hammer, but with the frame in the way, I just can't get a good swing. And once you unbolt the engine, you really need two people, one to hold the engine and the other to hit it. So yeah, let's get that bolt cut. Okay, so I made a mark right there where the bolt exits from the rotor. So I want to cut it probably right about there. I'd actually, in this case, rather make it a bit too short, because I can always back this screw out a turn or two if I make it too short. Perfect. So to get the rotor off, I do need to put threads on here. Usually I use an M12, 1.75. In this case, the diameter is smaller. So I have an M10, 1.5. That should do it. All right, well, the valves look pretty good. It doesn't look like they made contact with the piston when the connecting rod broke. And the cylinder itself, surprisingly, I mean, I know it's a little hard to see, but it's actually in very good shape. If I get up close here, you can see the crosshatch pattern. And that's shocking. You know, this engine is about 22 years old and obviously suffered some sort of traumatic event. But from what I can see of the cylinder, it looks very promising. So let's get this cover off the block and see what it looks like on the inside. Ooh. She's a fighter. Come on. Yeah, cylinder is looking pretty good. So I think potentially this block could be rebuilt. Still need to measure it up. The piston itself, for a second, I thought survived. But if you look here, it is cracked. And you look underneath where this pin is, it is cracked on both sides. So the piston is done. The crankshaft, a lot of aluminum transfer. Potentially that could be cleaned up. You know, the case, the oil sensor, the camshaft, all look pretty good. So I'm going to take a minute. I want to get this cleaned up. We'll probably quickly hone the cylinder, and then we'll measure the cylinder and the crankshaft and see where we're at. So just about ready to get that aluminum off the crankshaft, but I did want to take a second and just highlight some pretty big differences in quality. What I have up here are two sump covers. They're both from the same series, Briggs engine. The one on the right is the one we just took off. That one was built in 1999. The one here on the left was built in 2009. So there's a 10-year difference between these two, but theoretically, these parts are mostly compatible. This is the same series engine. And just looking at it, you can tell some pretty big differences. Obviously, the first being the lack of an oil sensor. That is critical for something like a generator that could run weeks on end. The second thing is the camshaft itself. you can see on the newer one, it's a lot less substantial. You know, these holes are cut out here. There's also plastic right here as part of the compression release. And even the lobes are separate pieces that are pressed on to this shaft. And the gear itself is pretty thin when compared to this one, the older engine. Much beefier, wider gear, no cutouts. And these lobes seem to be part of this shaft. They're not a separate piece that was attached. And of course, no plastic on the compression release. So much better part on the older machine. And even the casting, when you look at it, the quality looks a lot better. And this one is built a lot stronger too. If you look here, you have these 3 supports going across to add strength. And on the newer engine, those supports are not there at all. Anyway, a common question people ask is, can you add an oil sensor to the newer style generator? And my answer is yes, but why would you? It's a lot of money. Obviously, you got to take the engine apart. And, you know, the parts actually may not be available. I did take a look for the price on that oil sensor, and it's discontinued. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't another one that could fit in there, but it's not readily available from this parts diagram. So even if it was available, it's probably $45, $50. The casting here will accommodate it, but you do have to tap these threads. Also, the wire exits through here, which isn't machined out. So you have to machine that, buy whatever you need here to cap this off and keep it from leaking. And that's not the end of it. You also need the low oil module, which is a critical piece to the low oil system. This part actually is available. It's $45. And that also means you have to upgrade your switch. If you have an oil sensor, you need to have 3 tabs going into this switch, the third one for the oil sensor itself. And these switches aren't cheap either. I don't know exactly how much this one is, but I think they're around $30. So all in, you're looking at $100 in parts if you can find that part. And it's a lot of labor to do it. So, you know, I say just check your oil and you'll be fine. So to melt the aluminum off, I am going to use muriatic acid. It works quite well for taking off aluminum. It is pretty strong and can attack the iron here and actually cause rust and pitting. So don't go crazy with it. Don't keep it on too long. And most important, make sure you neutralize the acid with baking soda and water when you're done. All right, we're at the 10-minute mark. Gonna take a look and see how we're making out. Yeah, got a ways to go, but it's starting to clean up. Anyway, this usually takes about 30 to 40 minutes total. So I'll just continue on like I am and turn you on probably at the 40-minute mark. And at that point, we should be ready to polish that journal. So it's about 40 minutes now. Just going to take a look. It is actually coming off slower than normal. There was quite a bit of buildup of aluminum. So I have a feeling I'm going to have to go a bit longer. Yeah, this side looks pretty good. I don't see any defects in the journal. Now, there is still some chunks of aluminum stuck on the bottom here and still quite a bit right there. So it's going to need at least 10 more minutes. Well, it came out pretty good, actually. Haven't even touched it with sandpaper yet. There is a little teeny spot of aluminum still on the bottom. So I think I'm going to hit that for a few seconds with some 800 grit, see if it comes off, and yeah, I'll probably stop at that point. I do want to sand it with 1500 and 3000, but let's measure it up and see if it's even worth it. Yeah, that did it. About 20 seconds, and there's no more aluminum on this crank. So that's a good sign. I give this one hope. I am going to hit it with 1500 and 3000 grit while I'm here, and then we'll measure things up. Yeah, not too bad. You'd never know what this thing had been through. So let's see if there's enough meat left on this journal. All right, now the moment of truth. The reject size on this is 1.2475 or 1.2465. It depends on which document you look at. There is some disagreement on what this should be. The service manual is the higher number, 1.2475, but that manual, I have found some other errors in it that were 100% wrong. So my confidence in that manual isn't too high. The 1.2465 comes from a Briggs, I think, common specs chart, which is widely published on the internet. So I tend to believe that one a little bit more. Hopefully the specs are above both of those conflicting reject sizes, but if not, we'll have to make a decision. Okay, so the results are in, and it's not clear, I guess, the path to take on this one. Looking at these numbers, I took 3 sets of numbers in each direction, top to bottom, left to right. Starting on the PTO side, we are within spec, 1.2475, but then we got 1.2473, 1.2474. So these two are slightly out of spec. All these numbers are within spec. Now, this kind of is not clear cut as far as how to handle this. You know, this service manual clearly says 1.2475, but I have found other mistakes in this manual. So I'm not really giving this one too much credit. This other document, the Briggs check chart, it is published by Briggs and Stratton. It lists it as 1.2465. And I know you probably can't read this, so I'll put this up on the screen. So yeah, I guess the point is it's within spec according to one of the Briggs documents, and it's very close to in spec according to the other Briggs documents. So I'll probably use this crankshaft, but let's measure up the bore and see if that even matters. Okay, the bore gauge has been calibrated. I set it to 3.12 inches, and I may have done that a mistake. I noticed after the fact there is a range. The nominal amount is actually 3.119, but this is set at 3.12. Anyway, what I'm looking to see here is that the wear is less than 4 thousandths of an inch. So each increment on this dial is equivalent to half a thousandth. So I can only go up to about 8 lines, and then it's out of spec. Also, it needs to be round, and there's a spec on that. It's 1.5 thousandths out of round. It should be rejected. So I'm just checking the top of the ring travel first. And that's maybe half a thousandth of wear. That's good. Same there. And now the bottom. Yeah, that's good. Let's check the other direction. We're right at 0. About half a thousandth there. And about 1,000th of wear. So that's good, actually. We're within spec. We don't have too much wear. We're not out of round. So it's looking pretty good. I'm going to take a minute, just measure up these bearings here for the crankshaft as well as the camshaft, and I'll measure up the lobes and just everything else. Make sure we don't have any other issues, but things are looking pretty good. Well, I'm happy to report everything that I measured is within spec. And not only in spec, it's close to the standard spec, which means there's minimal wear on the bearings for the crankshaft or camshaft. The lobes, as well as the journals on the camshaft, come in perfect, as well as these journals here, the PTO side and the flywheel side journals. Everything's pretty much right at standard spec. So there's no question about it. Everything else is good. This here is the only gray area. I wish I knew which spec was right. Apparently Briggs doesn't know either because these two documents don't agree. So we are well within spec of the lower of the two numbers and pretty close on the higher of the two numbers. So I feel pretty comfortable ordering a new connecting rod and piston. So that's what I'm going to do. That'll take at least a week before they get here. So while I'm waiting on that, we do need to do some prep. Cylinder needs to be honed, valves lapped, and I'll probably paint up the exhaust while it's off. Definitely putting the cart before the horse, but I've got a week, so why not? Okay, the parts are on their way, so I want to finish prepping this. We'll start just with cleaning the head surface, and for that I usually use this plastic 3M Rolock disc. It's 120 grit, and it's meant for cleaning head gasket material off of aluminum. Some other tools I use, a little bit of Scotch-Brite, WD-40, and only when I need to, this razor blade. I try to avoid using it because it will scratch the aluminum if you're not careful. You can even see here, this head gasket must have been blown right there because there is definite exhaust exiting from the side of the head. So this engine would have been down on power when it was running. Yeah, something like that. So I'm going to do the same to this surface as well as the other side of the head and the sump cover. Okay, all the surfaces have been cleaned. All the gasket material is off here on the case, as well as the cover. Also did the mating surface here on the head. Still need to do the valves, and obviously you just saw me hone the cylinder, so it is ready to accept a new piston and rings. I was just turning my attention to the oil sensor. I wanted to test that and notice something, which leads me to believe that there's no way this sensor could have worked. Looking at it closely, I saw the insulation kind of looked like it had peeled away there. So I grabbed the wire just to see if it was connected, and this is what I saw. That screw is loose. So there's pretty much no way that sensor would have been able to kill the engine. And I think even worse, if that screw had come loose, it would have chewed up the engine pretty bad. So thankfully that didn't happen. I am going to remove that screw, put some Loctite on it, tighten it back up, and then we'll run some tests to see if that sensor even works. Okay, well, I think you missed it, but you didn't miss much. I just pulled the screw out, put a bit of Loctite on it, and reinstalled the screw. So the wire is tight now, and I did the same to that side. So let's hook up the multimeter and see if this thing even works. Okay, so I've got the multimeter set to ohms. Put one lead up here, which is the wire that exits and goes to the ignition coil to kill spark. And the other wire can go anywhere on the case. So right now, we should have a connection, and we do, because there's no oil in here. So the float should be down, and we should be making contact. So the sensor seems to be working. Now, if I rotate this upside down, the float should move away from the reed switch, opening this connection up. Yep, and it did. So we got no connection. Let's turn it back. And there we go. Seems to be working. I mean, the connection actually isn't as good as it was a second ago, but I don't have the values as far as what's good and what's bad. That is a connection. It will send something to the oil module, and hopefully that's enough for that module to kick in and shut the engine down. But yeah, the switch seems to be good, but the wire was loose. Okay, I'll let that sit for an hour or so. It'll help clean things up and also highlight any leaky valves. I'm a little bit impatient. It's been half an hour. And at first I thought it was leaking given what's going on down here. But actually that was just sneaking out through the spark plug hole. When I look at the valve stems themselves, they're dry. This here is the exhaust. Turn it around. and that's the intake. So the valves are actually doing what they should. I'll lap them anyway. But for now, let's get this cleaned up. The plastic brush that I have doesn't fit in here. So what I do instead is I use a little Dremel wire brush. I have a brass one and a stainless steel one. And the brass one theoretically is better, but I find it drops a lot of bristles and it takes a lot longer to clean. So I'm going to use the stainless steel one. Regardless of which one you use, you don't want to hit any of this surface, any of the sealing surface. And when you're done, make sure you wash it out, blow it out, and really inspect that to make sure there's no bristles left in there. Anyway, you get the idea. This is going to take a little while to get it perfect. And honestly, you don't have to get it perfect. You really just want to knock off any chunks that might break loose during combustion. And, at this point, it is runnable. But of course, when you do this, it does get a lot of carbon kind of in between the valve and the seat. So even if your valves did seat well before, now it's probably not unless you open the valve up and clean out that area. But I'm going to lap them anyway, so not a concern. So to get these valve springs off, you don't have to remove the rockers, but it'll make it a lot easier if you get these out of the way. In order to get the valves out, you need to compress the springs. There are these keepers that are holding the springs in place. You get the keepers out, then the spring and the valve should come right out. Yeah, before lapping these, I'm just going to clean these valves up a bit. There's a lot of carbon on here. Anyway, the best way I've found is just to put this in a drill, put a little WD-40 on it, and hold a piece of Scotch-Brite here and just let it polish up real nice. It'll knock a lot of this carbon off, and then we'll lap the valves. Yeah, I got a ways to go, but you get the idea. I'm just going to do that for a bit until it cleans up and do the same on the other valve. There's a close-up look at the intake, cleaned up very well. The exhaust would need a bit more work to make it perfect, but it is a million times better than what it was. So I think we're ready to get these lapped in, and we'll put the head back together. Okay, we'll start with the exhaust valve. You don't need a lot of this grinding compound, and you want to be careful not to get it on the stem. You really just want it on the lip of this valve. Make sure you get all the lapping compound off, both the valve and the seat. I'm also going to wash this out after just to make sure. But what you want is a nice line going around the valve. Kind of like that. Anyway, I'm going to do the same thing to the intake, and then we'll put this back together. The intake also looks good. Get a nice line going all the way around. So I'm going to take a minute, just spray everything out with some carb spray. Still need to wipe up the lapping compound off the seats, and then we can put this thing back together. Okay, let's get this thing back together. I did keep everything separated. The exhaust valve is on the right and the intake on the left. I don't know if these springs are different. They don't look different, but better to be safe. And these are tapered, so put the narrow end down. So this is about as far as I can take it. Everything's prepped and ready to go. We just need the parts. And the first part did arrive today. We've got the piston, and the rest should be here pretty soon. But this video, we've already covered quite a bit. We're approaching the hour mark, and we still have a ways to go. We have to reassemble the engine, test the engine, reassemble the generator, and test the generator. So I think this is a good place to cut. We'll pick up where we left off next week and hopefully finish all that up. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.